The flight attendant's voice was sharp. "You need to sit in your assigned seat, now." 12-year-old Rowan froze in the aisle, gripping his boarding pass. He had only asked for a simple seat change, an empty window seat just a few rows ahead. But Ms. Leora's expression was cold, her tone firm, like he had done something wrong. Passengers nearby glanced up, sensing tension. Rowan tried again, his voice polite. "But no one is sitting there." I said no. Her words cut through the cabin, final and absolute. What she didn't know? The boy's mother wasn't just any passenger. She owned the entire airline, and before this flight was over, she would make sure Ms. Leora regretted every word. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. The plane doors had just opened for boarding, and passengers moved slowly down the aisle, finding their seats. Among them was a 12-year-old boy named Rowan, gripping his boarding pass in one hand and adjusting the straps of his backpack with the other. He walked carefully, stepping aside to let others pass, his eyes scanning for his seat number. When he reached it, he paused. His assigned seat was in the middle, squeezed between two strangers. His heart sank a little. He had always loved sitting by the window, watching the ground disappear beneath the clouds, feeling like he was flying himself. A few rows ahead, he noticed an empty window seat. The person assigned to the aisle seat had already sat down, flipping through a magazine. The window seat remained unoccupied. He turned to the flight attendant nearby, a woman in a neatly pressed uniform, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. She stood tall, her expression sharp, as if every movement around her needed to be controlled. Her name tag read, Ms. Leora. "Excuse me," Rowan said politely, his voice steady but quiet. "Can I switch to that seat?" "It's empty." Ms. Leora barely glanced at him before shaking her head. "No seat changes, please take your assigned seat." He hesitated, glancing at the seat again. "But no one is sitting there." Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if his request had annoyed her. "Passengers are seated according to their boarding pass. If you wanted a window seat, you should have booked one." A man sitting nearby who had been listening looked up from his newspaper. His name was Mr. Callum, a businessman traveling alone. He glanced at the empty seat, then at the boy. "I don't mind if he switches," he said casually, nodding toward the empty space. "Doesn't seem like a big deal." Ms. Leora's lips pressed together in a thin line. She turned to Mr. Callum, her voice firm. "Sir, this is not about what you mind. It's about following the rules." Rowan's fingers tightened around his backpack strap. He hadn't expected such a sharp response. It wasn't as if he was asking to take someone else's seat. He opened his mouth to say something, but Ms. Leora's gaze hardened. "Take your assigned seat," she repeated, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Now." Rowan swallowed the frustration rising in his throat. His mother had always taught him to be respectful, to listen to adults, but something about this didn't feel right. Still, he gave a small nod and quietly walked back to his seat. As he sat down, stuffing his backpack under the seat in front of him, he could feel eyes on him. A few passengers had noticed what happened. Some looked uncomfortable, others quickly turned away, pretending not to have seen anything at all. He exhaled slowly, pulling out his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he started typing. "Mom, I asked to switch seats. The flight attendant refused. She was really rude about it." He hesitated before adding another message. "She said they'd call security if I didn't sit down." He hit send and placed the phone on his lap. His mother, Naomi Varon, was on the same flight, seated in first class. She wasn't the kind of person to overreact, but she also didn't tolerate unfairness. He knew she would see the message soon. A minute later, his phone buzzed. "What do you mean they'd call security?" Rowan glanced up toward the front of the plane where Ms. Leora stood, speaking with another crew member, Mr. Darren, who had just finished checking the first-class section. She didn't look in Rowan's direction, completely unbothered by what had just happened. Another message appeared on his screen. "What's the flight number?" He quickly checked his boarding pass and typed out the response. His heart beat a little faster. He wasn't sure what his mother was going to do, but something told him that this wasn't over. Not even close. Rowan's fingers curled around his phone as he waited for his mother's response. His stomach felt tight, not just from the embarrassment but from the unfairness of it all. He had been polite. He had asked a simple question. Why had Ms. Leora reacted as if he had done something wrong? Across the aisle, Mr. Callum, the businessman who had spoken up earlier, gave Rowan a small nod. That was unnecessary, he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. She didn't have to talk to you like that. Rowan just gave a small shrug, trying to brush it off, but his mind was racing. He had been on many flights before. Never had he been treated like this. His phone vibrated again. Another message from Naomi Varon. Stay where you are, don't say anything else, I'll handle it. Rowan's heart started to beat a little faster. He had seen his mother in action before. She was calm, precise, never the type to yell or lose her temper. But when she decided to handle something, it always ended with people realizing they had made a mistake. At the front of the plane, Naomi sat with perfect posture in her first-class seat, her face unreadable as she stared at her phone screen. She was dressed in simple but elegant travel wear, her dark hair tied back neatly. The flight attendant serving first class, Ms. Rhea, had just placed a glass of water on her tray, offering a polite smile. Is everything okay, ma'am? Ms. Rhea asked, noticing Naomi's sudden change in expression. Naomi looked up, her face calm but her voice carrying quiet weight. May I speak with the captain? Ms. Rhea blinked in surprise. The captain, ma'am? Naomi gave a single nod. Yes, there's something happening on this flight that I need to bring to his attention. There was something in the way she said it, measured, firm, confident. Ms. Rhea hesitated for only a second before stepping away, disappearing behind the curtain that led to the cockpit. Meanwhile, in the main cabin, Ms. Leora continued her checks, walking past rows of passengers as if nothing had happened. The way she carried herself made it clear she didn't expect any consequences. To her, Rowan was just another passenger, one she had already dismissed. She was so confident in that belief that when the intercom crackled to life, she barely noticed. Ms. Leora, please report to the cockpit immediately. The announcement made the entire cabin go silent. Heads turned. Even Mr. Callum lowered his newspaper, raising an eyebrow. Rowan sat still, but inside something shifted. Ms. Leora's posture stiffened. She had been working in the airline industry for years, and she had never been called to the cockpit mid-flight before. It was never a good sign. Still, she kept her face neutral, adjusting the cuffs of her uniform before making her way toward the front. She ignored the curious looks from passengers, ignored the faint whispers as she disappeared behind the curtain. Back in first class, Naomi took a slow sip of water as the door to the cockpit clicked shut behind Ms. Leora. She didn't need to see inside to know what was happening. She already knew exactly how this was going to end. Inside the cockpit, the air was tense. The captain, Gerald Whitlow, sat in his chair, hands resting on the armrests, his expression unreadable. Beside him, the co-pilot adjusted a few settings on the control panel, though his attention kept flicking toward the conversation about to unfold. On the screen of the in-flight communication system, a senior airline executive, Daniel Vance, appeared, his face calm, but his tone firm. Ms. Leora, Captain Whitlow said evenly, turning to face her. We've received a complaint regarding your treatment of a young passenger in economy. We'd like to hear your explanation. Ms. Leora forced a small professional smile, keeping her posture straight. Captain, I was simply following procedure. A boy attempted to change seats without authorization. I informed him that assigned seating must be followed, as per airline policy. The executive on the screen didn't blink. Is that all that happened? She hesitated, feeling a slight shift in the air. There was something about the way he asked the question, as if he already knew the answer. Yes, she said carefully. I instructed him to remain in his assigned seat, as is standard practice. Captain Whitlow exhaled through his nose. He wasn't a man who enjoyed unnecessary conflict, but he also valued order on his flights. "You told the boy," he said slowly, "that security would be called if he didn't comply. Is that correct?" Ms. Leora's stomach twisted slightly. She hadn't expected that detail to be brought up so quickly. She straightened her shoulders. "I only reminded him of standard procedures. If a passenger refuses to comply with crew instructions, we—" Daniel Vance interrupted her, his voice sharper now. "This was a 12-year-old child, Ms. Leora, not an unruly adult refusing to follow safety protocols." Ms. Leora's lips parted, but no words came out. Captain Whitlow folded his arms. "And do you realize who that child is?" For the first time, Ms. Leora felt something resembling unease creep into her chest. I don't understand." The airline executive leaned forward slightly. "His name is Rowan Varan. His mother, Naomi Varan, is seated in first class." He paused for just a second, letting the weight of the next word sink in. "She also happens to be the CEO of this airline." Ms. Leora's breath caught in her throat. For a moment she just stood there, trying to process what she had just heard. Naomi Varan. The name was instantly familiar. She had seen it in company-wide emails, in news articles about the airline's success. But she had never met the woman in person. And now she had just humiliated her son. A cold wave of realization crashed over her. The captain let the silence linger before speaking again, his voice lower now. "Ms. Leora, you removed a CEO's child from a perfectly available seat, dismissed his concerns, embarrassed him in front of passengers, and then threatened to call security on him. And you did all of that without even verifying if there was a legitimate issue with his ticket or the seating arrangement." The finality of his words made her stomach sink further. Daniel Vance glanced down at a document in front of him. "Mrs. Varan has made a formal request for an immediate correction. Here's what's going to happen, Ms. Leora." She held her breath, waiting. "You are going to personally escort Rowan Varan to the window seat he requested. You will apologize to him in front of the passengers you embarrassed him in front of. And when this flight lands, you will be required to provide a full explanation to the executive board." Ms. Leora's face burned, but she forced herself to nod stiffly. "Understood." "Good," the executive said. "Then fix your mistake." The screen went dark. The captain gestured toward the door. "You're dismissed." With every step back toward the economy section, Ms. Leora felt the weight of a dozen watching eyes. But the worst part wasn't the embarrassment. It was the realization that she had lost control of the situation entirely, and she had no idea what would happen next. Ms. Leora stepped out of the cockpit, her breath coming faster than usual. The cabin seemed different now, quieter, heavier. She had spent years walking these aisles with authority, making sure passengers followed the rules without question. But now, every step felt heavier than the last. She wasn't in control anymore. She had made a mistake, and now she was about to face the consequences. As she moved toward the economy section, passengers turned their heads. They weren't sure what was happening, but they could sense something was off. Whispers passed between them, a mix of curiosity and quiet judgment. Rowan sat in his seat, staring out at nothing in particular. He hadn't expected anything to come from his message to his mother. Maybe a frustrated text, maybe a talk with the airline later. But whatever she had done, it had worked fast. And now, Ms. Leora was standing in front of him, her usual rigid posture slightly weaker than before. She cleared her throat, forcing a tight, professional smile. "Mr. Varan," she said, keeping her voice steady but noticeably lower than before. "There's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you to the seat you requested." Rowan blinked, tilting his head slightly. She was speaking completely differently now, like she had been given orders she couldn't ignore. He didn't move immediately. He just watched her. Ms. Leora's hands twitched slightly at her sides. "I apologize for any inconvenience." A few passengers nearby exchanged glances. They had heard everything earlier. They knew she hadn't just been enforcing rules. She had been dismissive. Rowan shifted in his seat. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, his tone neutral. Ms. Leora's lips pressed together. Yes, there was... She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. An error in seating. An error, Rowan echoed. His voice wasn't raised. He didn't sound angry, but the way he said it made the moment stretch longer than it should have. She nodded stiffly. Yes. He studied her for a long moment before responding. I had my ticket. You saw it. And you still told me to sit down. The cabin had gone completely silent now. The people who had ignored what happened earlier were suddenly invested, their eyes flicking between the boy and the flight attendant. Ms. Leora swallowed. She wasn't used to being questioned like this, especially not by a 12-year-old. I may have misjudged the situation, she admitted, but I'd like to correct it now. Rowan didn't move right away. He pulled out his phone, tapped out a quick message, and then set it back down. Up in first class, Naomi Varan read the text from her son. She's asking me to switch now. What should I do? Her reply came almost instantly. Take your time, make her understand what she did. Rowan looked back up at Ms. Leora. I'll go back, he said calmly. But I want to know why you thought I couldn't sit there. Ms. Leora's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected that question. Passengers were openly listening now. Some shifted in their seats. Others pretended to be reading but kept their ears tuned in. Ms. Leora hesitated. It was just... But you didn't ask anyone else for their ticket, Rowan said, his voice still quiet, controlled. Just me. The weight of the question settled over the entire cabin. Ms. Leora's throat felt dry. She had always been the one in charge, the one setting the rules. But now she wasn't in control at all. The boy stood up, picking up his backpack. But before he moved past her, he said one last thing. If you're going to apologize, at least tell the truth. And with that, he walked to his new seat, leaving her standing there, feeling smaller than she ever had before. Ms. Leora stood frozen in the aisle, the weight of Rowan's words pressing down on her harder than any moment in her career. Passengers who had once been indifferent now watched her closely. Some looked away, uncomfortable with the silence that followed, while others waited, curious if she would actually answer his question. She had spent years making quick judgments, enforcing rules without question, controlling the cabin with confidence. But now, for the first time, she wasn't sure what to do. Rowan had already settled into his new seat by the window, his hands resting on his backpack. He didn't turn back to look at her. He didn't need to. The conversation was over. Ms. Leora swallowed hard and forced herself to move, walking briskly toward the front of the plane. But as she passed the first few rows of economy, she could hear the hushed voices. She didn't have a problem until she saw who was asking. He was just a kid. What was the harm in switching seats? She looked so confident before. Now, not so much. She clenched her jaw, ignoring them as she reached the galley. The space was small, tucked away from passenger view, but it wasn't empty. Standing there was Mr. Darren, the other flight attendant, watching her with a knowing expression. He had been there when she first dismissed Rowan. He had seen the way she handled it. And now, after watching her return alone, his gaze said everything he didn't need to say out loud. That didn't go well, did it? He said casually, stirring a cup of coffee. Ms. Leora shot him a sharp look. I don't need your comments right now. Mr. Darren smirked slightly, but didn't push further. Instead, he leaned against the counter, tapping a finger against the side of his cup. You know, he said, I've worked with you for a while now. I've seen how you deal with passengers. You're strict. Some might even say too strict. She exhaled through her nose, turning away. I follow the rules. That's my job. Sure, he said, tilting his head. But today wasn't about rules, was it? She didn't answer. Be honest with yourself, Leora, he continued, his voice lower now. If that had been any other passenger, an adult, someone who looked like they belonged in first class, would you have reacted the same way? She stiffened, because she knew the answer. Before she could say anything, the in-flight phone buzzed sharply. She flinched at the sound. Mr. Darren sighed and reached for the receiver, pressing it to his ear. Yes? He listened for a moment, then turned to her, his expression unreadable. It's for you. Her pulse quickened. She took the phone with careful fingers, pressing it to her ear. This is Ms. Leora, she said, her voice quieter than usual. A deep, measured voice responded on the other end. This is Naomi Varon. Ms. Leora's grip tightened around the phone. The CEO herself. There was a long pause before Naomi spoke again. I'd like to have a word with you before this flight lands. Ms. Leora swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. Understood, she managed to say. The line went dead. She slowly placed the receiver back onto the hook, her hands slightly unsteady. Mr. Darren raised an eyebrow. That bad? Ms. Leora didn't respond. She didn't have to. Because now she knew her mistake wasn't just an in-flight issue anymore. It was about to become something much, much bigger. Ms. Leora stood in the galley, her breath shallow, her hands still resting on the phone. The entire plane felt smaller now, the usual hum of the engines drowned out by the pounding in her chest. She had handled difficult situations before. She had dealt with demanding passengers, last-minute seat changes, even full-blown in-flight emergencies. But this was something entirely different. She turned, forcing her shoulders back as if standing straighter would somehow give her back the authority she had lost. Mr. Darren watched her, waiting for her reaction, but she said nothing. Instead, she stepped past him, moving toward the first-class cabin with deliberate steps. The walk felt longer than it should have. Every step brought her closer to a conversation she didn't want to have, a confrontation she hadn't prepared for. As she entered first class, she immediately spotted Naomi Varon. She was seated by the window, her posture relaxed, but there was something about the way she carried herself, composed, unreadable, that sent a chill down Ms. Leora's spine. She wasn't just any passenger. She was a woman used to control, to making decisions that affected thousands of employees. And right now, she was the one deciding what happened next. Ms. Leora stopped beside her seat, forcing a professional smile. Mrs. Varon, she said smoothly. You requested to speak with me? Naomi turned her head slightly, her expression calm, but her eyes were sharp, watching, measuring. Sit, she said simply. Ms. Leora hesitated. Ma'am, I wasn't asking, Naomi interrupted, her voice still low, controlled. That was enough. Ms. Leora sat down in the empty seat across from her, folding her hands in her lap, trying to steady herself. Naomi set her phone down on the table beside her, tapping her fingers against it lightly before speaking. Let's go over what happened earlier, she said. You denied my son a simple seat change. You spoke to him with an unnecessary level of authority. And then, when questioned, you refused to admit any wrongdoing, correct? Ms. Leora opened her mouth, but Naomi's gaze held her in place. I want the truth, Naomi continued. Not an excuse, not protocol, the truth. Ms. Leora swallowed hard. I misjudged the situation. Naomi didn't blink. And why do you think that is? Ms. Leora hesitated. Because he didn't look like a first-class passenger. Because I assumed he didn't belong there. Because I made a decision before I even looked at his ticket. The truth sat heavy on her tongue, but she couldn't say it. I was just following seating policy, she said instead. Naomi leaned back slightly, tilting her head. Were you? Ms. Leora forced herself to hold eye contact, though it felt like she was sinking further by the second. If another child had asked, one sitting with their parents in first class, dressed differently, acting more familiar with the space, would you have reacted the same way? The question sent a shiver through her spine. Ms. Leora faltered. She could feel her own heartbeat in her throat. Naomi didn't push further. She didn't need to. She picked up her phone, tapped a few times, then turned the screen toward Ms. Leora. It was an internal email, a direct message from the executive board. Her name was in it. This is your formal notice, Naomi said, setting the phone back down. Effective immediately, you're being placed under review for conduct. When this flight lands, you'll be escorted to a meeting where you'll explain your actions in detail." Ms. Leora's stomach dropped. "Mrs. Varen, Naomi raised a hand slightly, stopping her. "You don't need to defend yourself to me. You'll have a chance to explain yourself to the people who sign your paychecks." The finality of it hit her like a punch to the gut. "Is there anything you'd like to say before we land?" Naomi asked. Ms. Leora's lips parted, but no words came out, because for the first time she wasn't the one making the rules. She was the one being held accountable. Ms. Leora sat stiffly in the first-class seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The once familiar hum of the plane felt distant now, drowned out by the weight of the conversation she had just had. Naomi Varen watched her with an unreadable expression, waiting. There were so many things Ms. Leora wanted to say, justifications, explanations, anything to lighten the severity of what was happening. But deep down, she knew that nothing she said would change the fact that she had made a mistake. A mistake that wasn't just about a seat change, a mistake that revealed something uglier. She cleared her throat, trying to regain some control. "I never meant to disrespect your son," she said carefully. Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Never meant to," she repeated. "That's an interesting choice of words." Ms. Leora swallowed, feeling her palms dampen. "I only meant that. I was enforcing the rules." Naomi exhaled slowly, folding her hands on the table. "Let's make one thing clear. This isn't about rules. This is about how you treated my son compared to how you treat every other passenger. You didn't question anyone else about their seat, just him." Ms. Leora looked away for a brief moment, but there was nowhere to escape. She was completely trapped in this conversation. "You judged him before you even checked his ticket, didn't you?" Naomi asked, her voice still calm, still unshaken. Ms. Leora felt something deep in her stomach twist. She wanted to deny it, wanted to insist that it was just about following procedure. But she knew Naomi Varen wasn't the kind of woman you lied to. So she nodded slightly. Just once. Naomi sighed, not in anger, not in satisfaction, just as if she had expected that answer. "Then you understand why this is happening?" Ms. Leora's mouth felt dry. She nodded again. Naomi picked up her phone again, tapping out a message. "When this flight lands, you'll be escorted to a meeting. You'll have a chance to explain yourself to the board, and they'll decide whether or not you keep your job." Ms. Leora's stomach dropped. "Mrs. Varen, I've worked for this airline for 10 years. Naomi set her phone down. "Then you should have known better." The words hit harder than she expected. She opened her mouth, but Naomi was already turning slightly toward the window, signaling that the conversation was over. Ms. Leora sat frozen for a moment, then slowly stood. She had no choice but to walk away, leaving behind the most humiliating conversation of her career. As she moved back toward the galley, her feet felt heavy. She had always been the one in control, the one who set the rules, the one who commanded respect. But now she was the one passengers whispered about, the one they watched, the one who had finally lost control. Ms. Leora moved through the aisle with stiff, measured steps, each one heavier than the last. She could feel the weight of passengers' eyes on her, even though most pretended not to be watching. Conversations had quieted, but the atmosphere had shifted. She wasn't just another flight attendant anymore. She was the one who had been called out, the one who had been forced to backtrack. As she reached the galley, she exhaled sharply, gripping the counter as if steadying herself. The space felt smaller now, more suffocating than usual. She had spent years walking this plane like she owned it, enforcing rules with a firm, no-nonsense approach. But today, she had been forced to face something she had never considered before. She had made a bad call. And worse, everyone knew it. Mr. Darren was still there, leaning against the counter, sipping his coffee. He raised an eyebrow as she entered. "That went well," he muttered. Ms. Leora shot him a sharp look. "Not now, Darren." He smirked, setting his cup down. "Look, I'm not saying I told you so." "Then don't," she snapped. His smirk didn't fade, but he didn't push further. Instead, he studied her for a moment before shaking his head. "You really didn't think this one through, did you?" She let out a slow breath, turning away. "I followed the rules," she muttered under her breath. Darren scoffed. "Come on, Leora, be honest, this wasn't about rules. You saw a kid traveling alone and you assumed he didn't belong in a better seat. You didn't even check the ticket properly before deciding." Her jaw tightened. "I made a judgment call." "A bad one," Darren pointed out, "and now you're paying for it." Ms. Leora hated admitting when she was wrong, hated feeling like she had lost control of a situation, but there was no denying it now. She had misjudged the boy. She had assumed something about him without thinking, and now the mother of that boy was making sure she faced the consequences. She ran a hand down her face, feeling the tension in her temples. "What do you think's going to happen when we land?" Darren shrugged. "Depends. The execs might let you off with a warning, or they might make an example out of you." He gave her a pointed look, "Especially since the woman you disrespected owns the airline." Ms. Leora exhaled sharply. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, angry ones, entitled ones. But Naomi Varon wasn't just another passenger. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't demanding anything in the heat of the moment. She was handling it with precision, with calm authority. And that was what made it terrifying. Because people like that, they didn't just punish. They changed the rules. The in-flight phone buzzed again, and Ms. Leora flinched at the sound. Darren gave her a knowing look. "You gonna get that? Or do you already know what's coming?" She swallowed hard before reaching for the receiver. "This is Ms. Leora," she said, her voice quieter than usual. The voice on the other end was cool, controlled. "Ms. Leora, this is ground operations. You are to report directly to the airline executive office upon landing." She tightened her grip on the phone. "Understood." The call ended with a click. Darren let out a low whistle. "Well, that settles that." Ms. Leora set the phone down carefully, staring at it for a long moment. For the first time in years, she didn't know what would happen next. And that terrified her. Ms. Leora's hands were clammy as she gripped the edge of the galley counter. She had spent the past decade in the airline industry, climbing the ranks, earning a reputation for being strict but efficient. She prided herself on keeping order, on making sure the rules were followed. But now she wasn't enforcing rules. She was waiting for judgment. Darren stood across from her, arms folded, watching her with mild amusement. He wasn't the type to offer sympathy, and he certainly wasn't about to start now. "So," he said casually, "what's your plan?" Ms. Leora inhaled sharply, straightening her uniform. "I'll explain myself," she said, though the confidence in her voice felt forced. "I'll tell them exactly what happened." Darren gave a slow nod. "Sure, and then they'll ask you the same question Naomi Varon asked. Why him? Why did you stop that one kid and no one else?" She tightened her jaw. "It wasn't personal, wasn't it?" he challenged. "Would you have questioned a kid in a suit? A kid sitting next to a first-class parent? Or did you see Rowan dressed casually, sitting alone, and assume he wasn't supposed to be there?" Her fingers dug into the counter. "I didn't." She stopped herself. Because she did. She hadn't realized it at the time, but now that the moment was playing over in her head, she could see it clearly. She hadn't checked the system, hadn't radioed the gate agent, hadn't followed proper verification protocols. She had just looked at the boy and made a decision. Her stomach twisted. Darren let out a short breath. "Look, Leora, I don't think you're a bad person. But this," he gestured vaguely toward the cabin, "this is one of those moments that'll follow you. People will talk, passengers will remember. And Naomi Varon?" He gave a small shake of his head. "She's not just going to let this go." Ms. Leora stared down at the counter, her throat dry. She had been so sure of herself before, so sure that she was just doing her job. But now, as she played the interaction back in her head, she saw it for what it really was. A child had politely asked to move to an empty seat, and she had made him feel like a problem. She had dismissed him, embarrassed him, and threatened him with security. For what? For asking for something that any other passenger could have requested without issue? Her stomach churned. She turned, looking through the small window that separated the galley from the main cabin. From where she stood, she could just barely see Rowan in his new seat. He was quiet. He wasn't smirking or gloating. He wasn't drawing attention to himself. He just sat there, staring out the window, completely at peace, like he had known all along that things would be set right. That bothered her more than anything. She had spent the entire interaction treating him like he was out of line, but he had never raised his voice, never pushed back, never acted entitled. He had simply waited. Because he knew who his mother was, not in the way spoiled rich kids did, flaunting their connections to get what they wanted. He had just trusted that justice would come, and it had. Ms. Leora swallowed, glancing toward the first-class section. Naomi Varan was still seated, sipping her drink, her posture calm and unreadable. She had done what any mother would, defended her son, but she had done it without needing to raise her voice. That was what made it worse. If Naomi had yelled, if she had stormed to economy and demanded Ms. Leora be fired, it would have been easier to dismiss as an overreaction. But instead, she had handled it quietly, speaking only where necessary, making precise decisions that had real consequences. And now, Ms. Leora was the one holding her breath, waiting for what came next. The intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are in their upright positions. We will be landing shortly." The finality of the announcement made Ms. Leora's stomach twist. This flight was almost over, and when those wheels touched the ground, she had no idea if she would ever work on another one again. The cabin shifted slightly as the plane began its descent, the gentle tilt pushing passengers back into their seats. The usual routine began. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking seatbelts, making sure tray tables were up, ensuring everything was in order before landing. Ms. Leora moved on autopilot, her hands mechanically adjusting overhead compartments, nodding absent-mindedly as passengers asked last-minute questions. But her mind wasn't on the landing procedures. It was on what waited for her after. Every second that passed, every drop in altitude, was bringing her closer to the unknown. She had handled in-flight incidents before. She had dealt with difficult passengers, emergency diversions, and unruly situations that required security intervention. But she had never been the problem before. And this time, there would be no polite write-up, no discreet slap on the wrist. This time, her mistake had been seen. It had been witnessed. As she reached the back of the plane, she caught a glimpse of Rowan still seated near the window. He was calm, unaffected, his fingers idly tracing the zipper of his backpack as he looked out over the shrinking clouds. He was fine. He had been fine the entire time. But that wasn't the point, was it? The point was how she had made him feel in those first few moments. She had made him feel like he wasn't allowed to sit there, like his request was unreasonable, like he was out of place. And now she had to answer for it. She sighed, gripping the edge of an empty seat for support as she steadied herself. Still thinking about it? Ms. Leora turned to see Darren standing beside her, his arms crossed. He had been unusually quiet for the last few minutes, but now, as they neared landing, he studied her with a knowing look. She exhaled. "I don't know what's going to happen." Darren shrugged. "You probably won't, until the moment they tell you." She let out a dry laugh. "That's not comforting." He smirked. "Wasn't meant to be." Ms. Leora stared ahead, watching as the other attendants finished their final walkthroughs. Everything felt surreal. A few hours ago she had been in charge, enforcing the rules, keeping the flight in order. Now, she was a passenger on her own fate. Darren leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You want my advice?" She didn't respond right away, but eventually she gave a short nod. He glanced toward first class where Naomi Varan sat, still composed, still unreadable. "If she wanted to fire you on the spot, she could have, but she didn't. You know what that means?" Ms. Leora frowned, What? It means she's testing you, he said simply. She already knows she can get rid of you. That's easy. What she wants to see is if you'll own up to what you did, or if you'll make excuses. Ms. Leora looked down at her hands. For years, she had believed she was the best at what she did. She had been confident, firm, respected among the crew. But now, she wasn't sure if respect had come from doing her job well, or from the fear she had instilled in passengers who didn't want to be questioned. "Would you?" she asked quietly. Darren raised an eyebrow. "Would I what?" "Own up to it," she clarified. "If you were in my place." He studied her for a moment, as if debating how honest he wanted to be. Then he sighed, running a hand over his face. "Yeah," he admitted. "Because at the end of the day, Leora, it's not just about keeping your job. It's about the kind of person you want to be when you walk out of that meeting." She swallowed. The kind of person she wanted to be. She had never had to ask herself that before. She was Miss Leora, the rule enforcer, the one who never backed down, the one who never admitted to being wrong. But maybe that was the problem. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the intercom crackled. "Flight attendants, prepare for landing." Her hands tightened on the seatback in front of her. This was it. One way or another, this flight was about to end. And when the doors opened, she wouldn't be the one deciding what happened next. The plane's wheels made contact with the runway, sending a faint tremor through the cabin as the aircraft slowed. The usual post-landing routine began, passengers shifting in their seats, some reaching for their belongings, others already unlocking their phones. The overhead lights brightened slightly as the crew moved through final checks. But for Ms. Leora, none of it felt routine. She stood near the front of the galley, her hands clasped behind her back, staring straight ahead. The finality of landing hit her like a weight pressing down on her chest. She had been dreading this moment for the last hour, and now it was here. The doors hadn't even opened yet, and she already knew what was waiting for her on the other side. Darren appeared beside her, standing casually with one hand resting against the wall. "Well," he muttered, "moment of truth." She didn't respond. She could hear the passengers in economy unbuckling, murmuring about their connections, about their luggage, about what they had planned once they left the airport. They had the luxury of moving on. She didn't. The intercom crackled to life again. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off and the cabin doors have been opened." The seatbelt sign flicked off, and then the real shift happened. From her vantage point, Ms. Leora could see the first person to board the plane. It wasn't a passenger. It was a uniformed airline security officer. The moment he stepped inside, a hush fell over the first few rows of the cabin. Even the passengers who had been too caught up in their own business suddenly felt the tension. Ms. Leora's breath caught in her throat. She had expected something formal, an email, a request to report to the office, a discreet conversation. But this was public. The officer, a tall man with a radio clipped to his uniform, scanned the cabin briefly before his gaze landed on her. He nodded slightly. "Ms. Leora," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You'll need to come with me." Her legs locked in place. For the first time since she had started this job, she felt like a passenger being removed from a flight. She didn't move right away. Passengers were watching now. A few tried to pretend they weren't, keeping their eyes low, but others openly stared. They knew what was happening. Some had heard the earlier confrontation. Others had noticed the way she had walked back to the galley after escorting Rowan to his seat. And now, they were watching her get escorted off the plane. Darren let out a slow breath beside her. "Well, that's not good," he muttered under his breath. Ms. Leora still didn't move. The officer's expression remained neutral, but there was a quiet finality to his stance, like he had dealt with situations like this before, like he had seen plenty of employees go through this same process, all of them trying to hold on to a job that had already slipped away. "Ms. Leora," he repeated, "let's not make this harder than it needs to be." She swallowed, her throat tight. Slowly, she nodded. Passengers shifted in their seats, some murmuring to each other as she took the longest walk of her life toward the exit. She felt exposed in a way she never had before. This was her domain, her plane. She had always been the one standing tall in her uniform, directing people, deciding who followed the rules and who didn't. But today, she wasn't in control. Today, she was just another person being led away. As she stepped past first class, she caught a glimpse of Naomi Varon. She wasn't watching with satisfaction. She wasn't smirking. She was just sitting there, calm, composed, indifferent, because she had already won, not in a vengeful way, but in the way that meant something had finally changed. And Rowan? He wasn't looking at her at all. He was still gazing out the window, unaffected, as if this was just another flight. That, more than anything, made Ms. Leora's chest feel tight. She wasn't important in his story. She had been an obstacle, a moment of inconvenience, and now, she was nothing more than a lesson. The security officer gestured toward the open door. Without another word, Ms. Leora stepped off the plane, uncertain if she would ever step onto another one again. The moment Ms. Leora stepped off the plane, the change in atmosphere was immediate. The crisp, controlled environment of the aircraft was gone, replaced by the vast open space of the terminal. But it wasn't just the setting that felt different. It was the way people looked at her now. She had walked through this airport countless times before, always with confidence, always with purpose. But this time, she wasn't walking through as a flight attendant. She was walking through as a problem that needed to be dealt with. The security officer led her through a separate corridor, away from the regular passenger exits. Employees moved around them, pilots heading to their next flights, flight attendants preparing for their shifts, gate agents scanning boarding passes, but they all knew something was off. She felt their eyes flicker toward her, some subtle, some not. Word traveled fast in the airline industry, especially when someone in uniform was being escorted. Her steps felt heavy, but she kept her posture straight, forcing herself to hold on to what little control she had left. After a few turns down private hallways, the security officer stopped outside a conference room. She swallowed. This was it. The door opened and she stepped inside. The room was smaller than she expected. Plain, no windows, a long table at the center with a few chairs neatly arranged. But it wasn't the room itself that sent a chill down her spine. It was the three people seated inside. At the head of the table sat Daniel Vance, the senior airline executive who had appeared on the cockpit screen earlier. He was flipping through a printed report, barely acknowledging her entrance. Beside him was Sarah Lynn, the director of in-flight services. Her face was unreadable, her hands folded neatly on the table. And finally, Naomi Varon. Ms. Leora had hoped, prayed that Naomi would simply file her complaint and let the board handle it. But no. She was here, sitting across from her, calm, composed, waiting. Ms. Leora's stomach twisted. Daniel Vance finally looked up, gesturing to the chair across from them. "Take a seat, Ms. Leora." She hesitated for only a second before moving forward. She sat down, adjusting her uniform out of habit, but the professional polish she had carried for years now felt meaningless. A long, stretched silence filled the room. Then Daniel set down the report. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Tell us exactly what happened on that flight." Ms. Leora inhaled sharply, choosing her words carefully. "I was enforcing seating policies," she began. "A young passenger asked to switch seats, and I informed him that it was not allowed." Daniel's expression didn't change. "And did you enforce this policy with other passengers?" She hesitated. Sarah Lynn tilted her head slightly. "Did anyone else request a seat change?" Ms. Leora's throat felt dry. She knew what they were getting at. She had singled out Rowan. I didn't question any other passengers," she admitted. Naomi finally spoke. "Why?" That single word made Ms. Leora's stomach drop. Naomi wasn't angry. She wasn't pressing for dramatic apologies. She just wanted the answer, the real answer. And that was the worst part. Because for the first time, Ms. Leora had to say it out loud. She glanced down at her hands, then back up. "I misjudged him," she finally admitted. Silence. Then, Naomi leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked onto hers. And why did you misjudge him? Ms. Leora felt like she was sinking. She could lie. She could say she was just being strict, that she had no bias, that it was just an unfortunate misunderstanding. But everyone in this room already knew the truth. So she swallowed hard and forced herself to face it. Because of the way he looked, she whispered. The words felt heavier than she expected. The room was completely still. Naomi sat back, exhaling softly. There it is. Daniel steepled his fingers. You do understand that this isn't just a minor complaint, correct? This is about how you represent the airline, how you treat passengers. This is about an employee making an assumption without verifying the facts. Ms. Leora nodded weakly. I understand. Sarah Lynn shifted a document toward her. We have statements from passengers who witnessed the exchange. Some described your tone as unnecessarily harsh. Others said you were dismissive. Ms. Leora clenched her hands together. She had spent her whole career believing she was fair but firm. But today, she was realizing something ugly. She hadn't been fair at all. Naomi's voice was softer now, but just as controlled. My son didn't need special treatment, Ms. Leora. He didn't need a free upgrade or priority service. He just needed to be treated like everyone else. But you made him feel like he didn't belong. That's the problem. Ms. Leora's heart pounded. Daniel exchanged a glance with Sarah before turning back to her. You've been placed under review, effective immediately, he said. For now, you are suspended from all flights. Your final disciplinary action will be determined after this hearing. Ms. Leora's breath hitched. Suspended. She knew it was coming, but hearing it out loud made it feel real. Daniel stood, gathering his papers. You'll be notified within 72 hours about our decision. Sarah Lynn closed her folder. If you have anything else to say, now is the time. Ms. Leora hesitated. What was there to say? She had spent years enforcing rules, believing she was doing her job well. But now, she saw it from the other side. The way she had spoken to Rowan, the way she had dismissed him so easily. It wasn't just one mistake. It was a reflection of something deeper. And the only thing she could do now was own it. She looked directly at Naomi. I'm sorry, she said. Not because she had to, not because it would save her career, but because, for the first time, she truly meant it. Naomi Veron didn't react right away. She simply watched Ms. Leora, her expression steady, as if she were measuring the weight of the apology. Ms. Leora held her breath. She had said the words, but they felt small compared to everything that had already happened. Would they even matter? Daniel Vance glanced at Naomi, then back at Ms. Leora. You're sorry, he repeated as if testing the words. Yes, she said firmly. Sarah Lynn tapped a pen against the table. And what exactly are you sorry for, Ms. Leora? Are you sorry because you were caught, or because you now realize what you did was wrong? Ms. Leora's stomach twisted. She had spent her entire career as someone who never backed down, someone who never apologized unless absolutely necessary. But for the first time, she wasn't thinking about herself. She was thinking about the way Rohan had looked at her, not with anger, not with frustration, but with calm confidence. She was thinking about the moment she had made the decision about him before even checking his ticket. She was thinking about how easily she had dismissed him, simply because of who she assumed he was. She sat up straighter. I'm sorry because I made a decision based on an assumption, because I treated a young passenger unfairly, when I should have taken an extra moment to verify the situation. Sarah nodded, as if satisfied with that answer. Good, because if your apology was just about your job, it wouldn't mean anything. Ms. Leora swallowed. She was afraid of losing her job. Of course she was, but that wasn't the only thing weighing on her now. She had always seen herself as someone who followed rules, but what she had done to Rowan wasn't just about policy. It was about how she saw people, and how, in one careless moment, she had let that blind her to the truth. Naomi finally leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the table. "What will you do if you're allowed to return to work, Ms. Leora?" Ms. Leora blinked. She hadn't expected that question. For a brief second, hope flickered. She was still suspended. The review process was still happening. But Naomi's question meant something. It meant there was a possibility that this wasn't the end. She inhaled slowly. "I'll be better," she said honestly. "I won't make quick assumptions. I won't let my own judgments decide how I treat a passenger. And if I do have to enforce a policy, I'll do it the same way for everyone, no matter who they are." Naomi studied her carefully. She had every reason to push for her termination. She had every right to ensure Ms. Leora never worked for the airline again. But Naomi wasn't vengeful. She wasn't just looking for punishment. She was looking for change. Finally, Naomi sat back. "We'll see." It wasn't a yes. It wasn't a no. But it was something. Daniel stood gathering his papers. "We'll notify you within 72 hours about your final status with the airline. Until then, you are not to report to any flights." Ms. Leora nodded, standing up as well. For the first time, she didn't feel defensive. She didn't feel the need to argue, to push back, to protect herself, because she had finally understood. She turned to Naomi. "Thank you," she said quietly. Naomi gave a small nod but said nothing else. The meeting was over. Stepping into the unknown, Ms. Leora walked out of the conference room feeling lighter and heavier at the same time. The airport still buzzed with life, passengers rushing to their gates, families reuniting, employees moving in and out of terminals. For years, this had been her world. She didn't know if it still would be. But for the first time, that uncertainty didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a lesson. As she walked toward the exit, she pulled out her phone, scrolling through messages. Most were from co-workers, all of them asking what had happened. She ignored them. Instead, she did something she had never done before. She opened her airline's internal app and searched for diversity and inclusion training. For years, she had thought she knew everything about handling passengers. But today, she had learned the most important lesson of all, and whether she got her job back or not, she wasn't going to make the same mistake again. Ms. Leora stepped out of the administrative offices, the airport terminal stretching ahead of her like a world she wasn't sure she still belonged to. She had walked these halls for years, wearing her uniform with pride, believing that she was in control of everything within her domain. But today, she wasn't in control of anything. She was just another person caught in the weight of her own actions. She moved toward the staff exit, where employees typically filtered in and out, their schedules dictated by the steady hum of airline operations. She wasn't heading to another flight, wasn't preparing for another shift. She had nowhere to go. Her mind replayed everything that had happened. Rohan's quiet confidence, Naomi Varen's sharp but measured words, the silence in that conference room when she finally admitted what she had done. For the first time, she saw herself from the outside. She saw herself standing over a young boy, telling him he couldn't switch to a seat that was completely empty. She saw herself dismissing his request without a second thought. She saw herself threatening to call security, not because he was causing a problem, but because she didn't want to be questioned. Her hands clenched at her sides. She had been so certain in that moment, certain that she was enforcing the rules, certain that she had the authority to make that call. But certainty had never meant she was right. She reached the exit doors, hesitating for a moment before stepping outside. The rush of warm air hit her instantly, a sharp contrast to the controlled coolness of the airport's interior. The real world felt bigger than she remembered. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was someone who had made a mistake that everyone had seen. She pulled out her phone again, staring at the airline's internal app. The Diversity and Inclusion Training tab was still open. For years, she had rolled her eyes at mandatory training sessions, brushing them off as corporate formalities. She had thought she already knew everything she needed to know, but today had proven otherwise. Her finger hovered over the Enroll Now button. She hesitated, because pressing that button meant admitting that she still had things to learn. It meant acknowledging that the person she had been for years wasn't good enough anymore. Her stomach twisted. For so long she had lived by one rule: never back down. But today she had learned a new rule: never stop learning. She exhaled and pressed the button. A notification popped up instantly. Enrollment confirmed. It was a small action, but for the first time all day she felt in control again. The departure of who she used to be. She glanced around the employee parking lot, looking for familiar faces. A few of her coworkers were scattered across the lot, chatting before heading home. Some of them had probably heard what happened. Some had probably been waiting to see if she would still have a job tomorrow. She wasn't sure yet. But she did know one thing. She wasn't the same person who had stepped onto that flight earlier today. And whether she got her job back or not, she wasn't going to forget this. As she made her way toward her car, her phone buzzed. A new email. Her breath hitched as she saw the sender. Airline Executive Board. The subject line read, "Final review meeting scheduled." Her heart pounded as she opened it. "Ms. Leora, your final review has been scheduled for tomorrow at 10 a.m. Your presence is required for the final decision regarding your employment status. Please check in with HR upon arrival." She stared at the screen, her fingers tightening around the phone. Tomorrow. It was happening tomorrow. She had one night to prepare. One night to decide what kind of person she would walk into that room as. For the first time in her career, her future wasn't guaranteed. But maybe that wasn't a bad thing. Maybe this was her chance to become better. She inhaled deeply, squared her shoulders, and headed toward her car. Tomorrow would decide everything, and this time, she would be ready. The morning air was crisp as Ms. Leora pulled into the airline's headquarters, her fingers tightening around the steering wheel. The parking lot was nearly full, a clear sign that the company's executives, HR personnel, and senior managers were already inside, preparing for the review that would determine her future. She sat in her car for a moment, staring at the towering glass building in front of her. She had walked through those doors so many times before, confident, purposeful, in control. But today, she wasn't in control of anything. She had spent the night replaying everything in her head, going through every scenario, every possible outcome. She knew she could argue that she had just been following the rules. She knew she could try to defend herself, push back, insist that she was being treated unfairly. But she also knew something else. That wasn't the truth, and after everything that had happened, the one thing she owed, to herself, to Rowan, to every future passenger she would ever interact with, was honesty. She took a deep breath, grabbed her bag, and stepped out of the car. Inside the building, the receptionist greeted her with a neutral nod. There was no warmth, no polite small talk, just a simple professional acknowledgement. People knew. She was escorted to the conference room on the third floor, a cold, windowless space reserved for serious internal reviews. The door was already open when she arrived. Inside, the same faces from yesterday sat at the long conference table. Daniel Vance, Sarah Lynn, and of course, Naomi Varan. Unlike yesterday, Naomi wasn't just an observer now. She was leading this meeting. That was when it hit Ms. Leora. Naomi had never been just a concerned mother filing a complaint. She had been watching, measuring, deciding. This wasn't just about punishment. This was about whether she was worth keeping at all. "Ms. Leora, please have a seat," Daniel said, gesturing toward the empty chair across from them. She obeyed, sitting with her hands in her lap, keeping her posture straight despite the way her stomach twisted inside. Sarah Lynn folded her hands. "We've reviewed all reports from the flight, including passenger statements, the pilot's observations, and of course the complaint filed by Mrs. Varan." Naomi remained silent, but her gaze never wavered. Ms. Leora swallowed. "I understand." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Before we move forward, we want to hear from you. What is your perspective on what happened?" This was it, the moment that would decide everything. She could lie, spin a story about miscommunication and misunderstood intentions. She could say she had been under stress, claimed she hadn't meant for it to escalate the way it did. But that wasn't the truth. She inhaled deeply and met their eyes. I was wrong. A brief silence settled over the room. I misjudged a passenger, she continued. I made an assumption before checking the facts. And in doing so, I embarrassed a young boy and made him feel like he was less important than the other passengers. Daniel exchanged a glance with Sarah, but neither spoke. Naomi, however, studied her carefully. And why did you do that? Ms. Leora's stomach clenched, but she didn't let herself falter. Because I saw a child traveling alone in economy, and assumed he wasn't supposed to be anywhere else. I let my own bias cloud my judgment instead of following proper protocol. Her own words made her chest feel tight. Admitting it out loud made it real. Naomi remained unreadable. And do you understand why that's a problem? Yes, she said without hesitation. Because it means I wasn't treating all passengers equally. It means I failed to do my job fairly. And it means I contributed to an experience that never should have happened. The room was silent again, but this time it felt different. Sarah Lynn finally spoke. In your years with this airline, you have been known for your professionalism. You have handled difficult passengers, in-flight emergencies, and last-minute changes with precision. However, she tapped her fingers against the table. We also received complaints about your strict enforcement of policies without consideration for individual circumstances. Some passengers have described you as overly harsh. Ms. Leora's hands curled slightly. She had always taken pride in being a strict enforcer of the rules. But now, she saw the problem. It's not just about following the rules, Naomi said, her voice steady. It's about knowing when to enforce them and when to use discretion. Rowan wasn't breaking any safety regulations. He wasn't causing a problem. He was simply asking for something reasonable. And instead of assessing the situation, you immediately shut him down. Ms. Leora nodded. I understand that now. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Do you? Yes, she said without a single doubt in her voice. Daniel leaned back in his chair, exchanging another glance with Sarah. Finally, he exhaled and turned back to Ms. Leora. Here's what we've decided. The air felt thick, the moment stretching longer than it should have. You are being placed on a 4-week unpaid suspension. You will be required to complete bias and customer relations training, after which you will be reassigned to a lower-ranking position for a 6-month probationary period. Ms. Leora's breath hitched slightly. She wasn't losing her job, but she wasn't keeping it as it was. She had spent years building her rank, earning the respect of her crew. But now, she was being knocked down, forced to start again at the bottom. Sarah Lynn leaned forward. If you choose to return after your probation, you will have the opportunity to reapply for your previous role. But make no mistake, this is a final warning. If we receive another complaint like this, your employment will be terminated immediately. Ms. Leora nodded. She had expected as much. But strangely, it didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a second chance. A rare opportunity to prove, to herself, to the airline, and to every passenger she would ever interact with, that she could change. Naomi Varon finally spoke again, this time with something that almost resembled approval. What you do with this opportunity is up to you. I hope you use it well. Ms. Leora met her eyes and for the first time felt genuine gratitude. Thank you, she said, meaning it more than she ever had before. Daniel nodded. Your suspension starts immediately. You're dismissed. She stood, smoothing her uniform before giving them all one last look. Then she turned and walked out of the room. The flight ahead. As she stepped out of the building, the morning light felt different on her skin. The air was the same. The world was the same. But she wasn't. She wasn't the same flight attendant who had stepped onto that plane. She wasn't the same person who had blindly followed rules without considering the people affected by them. She had been given a second chance. And this time, she wasn't going to waste it. She took one last look at the building behind her, then turned toward the future. Ready to rebuild, ready to learn, and ready to finally do better. That's the end of the story. What do you think? Did Ms. Leora deserve a second chance? Or should she have lost her job? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you like this video, make sure to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.